The series, after 6 years of dating, my wife Lynn and I got married 11 months ago. Throughout our whole relationship, everything has been rather typical, and I have never once observed any unusual patterns or warning signs. I can't emphasize enough how completely out of character this is for her. Lynn is insightful, smart, and incredibly kind. She has always been a straightforward individual. She wouldn't typically act like a child or try to frighten me. She's not. Even a fan of horror films. She knew how much I like horror, so when we first started dating, she agreed to see The Shining with me. She didn't even watch half of the film before we had to turn it off because she was so terrified. She has never been into pranks and has no interest in anything eerie. She simply doesn't enjoy it. And it's okay. However, that's what made this so peculiar. She just isn't like that. She has never had any mental health problems, and from what I understand, it doesn't run in her family. Although I am aware that some people are able to conceal their mental health issues, I believe I would have noticed some kind of indication during our 6 years of dating. Before going to work 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen brewing myself some coffee. I knew I wouldn't be able to get my morning fix at Dunkin' Donuts because I was running a little late that morning. I was hurrying down the hall toward the front door when I noticed Lynn staring at me from around the corner ahead of me. I took a sip of my coffee. All that was visible to me were her eyes and a long, dark hair strand that was dangling against the wall. Behind the corner, the remainder of her body was hidden. When I first saw her, I almost dropped my coffee. Indeed, I did burn the feces from my mouth. I wiped a few drops of coffee off my pants and remarked, "Geez, Lynn, you scared the shit out of me." Like a small child who has been trapped, she instantly vanished from sight. She scampered off toward the living room, and by the time I reached the front door, she had vanished from view. As I mentioned, it was incredibly strange and completely out of character for her, but I also thought it was sort of humorous that she was acting less serious and more playfully. I called her a weirdo and yelled that I loved her. I heard her giggling as I closed the door. Although her behavior was a little strange, it was definitely not enough to summon a priest. By lunchtime, I had forgotten about it, and by the time I arrived home, she was returned to her usual self. Neither she nor I mentioned it, and life continued as usual. 3 days later, the second occurrence took place. I had awakened up to fetch a drink at around 2 in the morning. I had a distinct impression that I was being observed when I was standing at the kitchen island with a jug of OJ. For some reason, my wife's beaming face was staring back at me from the floor. She was looking up at me with big, unblinking eyes and a smile on her face as she peeked at me from across the island. With a Cheshire cat smile, I will admit that I yelled. It was terror, not annoyance. I was afraid at the time for some reason. Lynn ran out of the kitchen on all fours, her hands and feet slapping the tile floor as she crawled backwards out of my line of sight at the sound of my scream. Neither did I yell after her, nor did I chase after her. I simply stood there in disbelief, wondering what the devil had made her do that. I eventually went back upstairs, though it took me a little longer than I'd like to confess. Lynn was asleep, on her side in our bedroom when I arrived, or at least acting like it. To be sure she was truly asleep, I stood there for a bit and watched her breathing. I thought she might burst out at me as soon as I climbed into bed. However, she didn't. She didn't even move when I got into bed. She was breathing deeply and softly, and I began to question whether I had dreamed the entire affair. I waited for her to come down for coffee the following morning, and after giving her a mug and giving her a cheek kiss, I made the decision to ask her about it. In order to avoid upsetting or embarrassing her, I said in a light-hearted manner, "What was that about last night?" She scowled at her coffee and shook her head as if she didn't understand what I was talking about. I pointed to the area on the floor near the kitchen island and said, "You were peeking at me again from over there." She followed my eyes and she erupted in laughter as soon as she saw me again. I couldn't resist joining in on her laughter. "You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that?" I replied. She put her cup on the counter, put her arms around neck and giggled. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even." She laughed. We departed for work after saying our goodbyes. I couldn't stop thinking about how unsettling it had been to see her smile that way behind the island while I was driving. The sounds she made as she crawled away with her hands on the floor. She was only trying to be goofy, I reminded myself, just attempting to share my passion for everything horror-related. I wasn't really scared of her. I still wasn't comfortable with it, though. She began to peek at me more frequently. She would occasionally peep out from behind the drapes in the living room or the couch. At one point, she even succeeded in entering her grandmother's antique trunk, which is located at the foot of our bed. If she hadn't been revealed by the rusted hinges on the trunk, I might not have even realized she was there. Only half of her face showed through the lid, which she had propped up just enough. She had been smiling like a happy child. It was eerie. I was at a loss as to what to say to her. I was limited to staring. When I was able to speak again, I asked her why she was acting in this way. She closed the trunk lid slowly and trapped herself inside, but she didn't respond. I simply turned to leave, feeling uneasy. She was obviously delighted doing it, but I couldn't understand why. All I could hope was that she will become bored with the game soon. For the next 2 weeks, Lynn didn't even glance at me. I was glad when I began to believe she was finished with her strange trick. I joked that I hadn't. Noticed her peeking at me recently and that she must have given up on her spy game when we were watching a Netflix series. Then she smiled slightly and continued, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." Though I remained silent, I pondered if she was kidding. I kept thinking about what she had said for the following few days. Did I simply fail to see her peering at me when I wasn't looking? What on earth was she hoping to gain from this, if at all? I became worried and kept looking around to see if she was behind a door or around the corner. When I was at home and she wasn't directly in front of me, I got jittery. I felt somewhat insane and foolish. However, I started to calm down after a few weeks without another episode. I convinced myself it was just a terrible memory and stopped looking behind walls and furniture. Then things were significantly worse. A few days ago, I relaxed on the couch and played a few games on my laptop while Lynn went to a friend's house. I got into the shower at around 9 o'clock at night, and as I was shampooing my hair with soap, I had the terrible sense that someone was watching me. I nearly had a heart attack when I gently opened my eyes. Lynn's entire head was extended into the shower, leaving only her torso visible as she peered out from behind the curtain. The ends of her long, dark hair were dripping with water as it draped against the curtain. Her eyes were red and big, as though she hadn't blinked in a long time, and her lips hung open in a horrible grin. I jumped back against the wall and yelled. She remained motionless, her smile unwavering. 2 dark streaks of makeup slid down her cheekbones. She appeared utterly insane and euphoric. I was so freaking scared. For a few moments, neither of us spoke as we stood like that. She gently drew her head out of the shower after what seemed like an eternity, and I saw her hazy figure through the curtain as she walked back toward the bathroom door. The bathroom door slammed shut, loud enough to shake the mirror. A second later, I let out another scream and leaped from the shower to secure the door. I spent more than an hour in the restroom. Perhaps I responded too strongly to some of you. Joke or not, though, I could no longer stand the weird shit. I kept repeating that to myself while I paced my bathroom, pausing every few minutes to listen at the door. I strained to listen as I pushed my ear against the bathroom door after hearing a muffled sound. I imagined Lynn standing on the other side of the door, laughing at her joke, even though I couldn't hear anything. Anger shot through me. I was furious that I had to hide in the bathroom for an hour and be forced to feel afraid in my own home. For what? A joke? It was a terrible joke if it was one. I said, "What the fuck, Lynn?" I waited for her to call me a jerk or apologize, saying, This shit is getting really fucking annoying. Instead, there was a tiny murmur that was so soft I wasn't sure I heard it, followed by total silence. "Lynn?" I yelled, my voice trembling. Too much to conceal it. I received no reply, only my own labored breathing. I banged my fist against the door and screamed, "I swear to God, just fucking stop it!" I waited for her to yell at me, as I would anticipate when I spoke to her in such a manner. I had never before screamed at her. However, nothing was present. Only the showerhead's sporadic drip. I admit that I was afraid. I'm too scared to confront my own wife and open the damn door. I waited for another half hour or so, which, when you're afraid, seems like forever. I finally went down on my knees and looked beneath the bathroom door because I didn't want to spend the night hiding there. Fortunately, I didn't see her face looking back at me, even though I almost expected to. Lynn was not there, but I could see all the way down the hall to the top of the stairs. I wasn't sure if I should be pleased about that. I waited for her, had to appear over the top step for several minutes, but it never did. I got up, positioned my hand over the door, and readied myself to open it with my mind. I was ready to yank it open after carefully turning the lock with unsteady fingers, when I heard a sound that still makes me sick to my stomach. There was a moan, louder than before, but I could see exactly where it was coming from. As though in slow time, I turned my head to face my wife, who was looking at me through the small opening in the closet door. Her lips was hanging out in the most hideous gaping smile I had ever seen, and her eyes were still as big as ever. I didn't even let out a cry. Even that terrified me too much. Her body was shaking with pure joy, her hands clenched to her chest, as though she was scarcely able to control her pleasure. Her throat released a brief, deep, harsh moan that sent a chill through my whole body. I somehow managed to open the bathroom door and dash down the stairs as quickly as I could, grabbing my phone and keys off the living room table before sprinting outside to my car. Her harsh laughing could be heard behind me, but I didn't hear her approaching. I didn't spend any time closing the front door. I shivered the whole way, either from the cold or dread, and drove away from the house quicker than I was legally allowed to. Perhaps a bit of both. I hadn't even picked up a pair of shoes or a coat. My hair was still wet, and I remained in my boxers. I ignored every call and text I received and drove directly to my brother Chris's place, which was around 40 minutes away. I waited until I was securely parked in my brother's driveway before checking my phone. Lynn had called me 4 times and texted me a lot, all of them wanting to know where I had gone and why I had left like that. I was so angry at her casual attitude that I flung my phone at the dash. Despite being shocked to see me, especially wearing only boxers, my brother and his wife told me to remain as long as I needed to. Chris asked me what had happened and lent me some clothing. I didn't go into specifics when I informed him that Lynn and I had a fight. Even if it was an odd joke, I didn't want him to think I was going overboard and abandoning my wife. After all, hadn't I been urging her to be less serious and more lighthearted for years? This was definitely not what I had envisioned when I had hoped that she would relax and loosen up. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to fall asleep on their sofa. Lynn's face was always looking at me from the closet when I closed my eyes. It made my skin crawl to know she had been in there with me the whole time. She had never left the damned restroom. To trick me, she slammed the bathroom door shut and slipped into the closet. I felt anxious just thinking about returning home. I couldn't sleep, so I tossed and turned. I was able to get some sleep after Chris gave me a sleeping tablet. I had horrible dreams while I slept, the entire smile on Lynn's face. The sun had just begun to rise when I woke up. I felt exhausted and my body ached from the sofa. I knew I would eventually need to give Lynn a call, but I was at a loss for words. Until she promised me she wouldn't do any more strange crap, I wouldn't be returning home. All I wanted was for my wife to return. I never thought she looked so gorgeous as her typical somber self. I was thinking about giving her a call and telling her that when I experienced that familiar sensation. They were watching me. My heart was in my throat as I gazed toward the ceiling. The longer I ignored the emotion, the worse it got, even though I didn't want to turn away. Almost by itself, my gaze strayed from the ceiling. She had that same wide smile on her face as she stared down at me from the window next to the couch. 2 long lines of drool ran down the glass as it trickled down her lips. She had been there for a long time, maybe all night, but I had no idea how long she had been there. I was concerned that my rage overcame my fear at that point, but I didn't bother yelling. I leapt off the sofa and banged my hand against the window pane. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I yelled. "Now!" She remained still, and her horrifying face remained the same, as if she had never been happier. Her smile simply got bigger. Upstairs, I could hear Chris and his wife pacing. Lynn's head jerked slightly toward them, as though she could hear them from outside, and she started to gently close her mouth. Chris down the stairs when I turned around. Lynn was gone when I looked back out the window. The 2 streaks of drool still running down the glass were the only indication she had been there at all. When I woke up, clearly worried, called my name from upstairs. He and his wife, Rebecca, were running. I tried to explain to Chris and Rebecca that Lynn was observing me through their window. They had doubts, and who wouldn't? Chris and I went outside to the location in front of the window, but the dirt had a little depression rather than any footsteps. Chris guessed it was an animal, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca didn't understand, and I was too exhausted to tell them that I had dreamed the entire scenario. That day, I switched off my cell phone and called in sick from work. I was unwilling to confront Lynn. I was at my breaking point, just chatting to her. I became convinced that there was something seriously wrong with her, that we would never be the same again, regardless of the assurances she made. I was deeply upset by the thought. The majority of the morning, I sobbed. I thought I was prepared to face her by noon, give her one final opportunity to clarify. I persuaded myself that after 6 years, I could at least give her that. When I switched on my phone, I saw the several texts she had sent, all from a wife, who seemed to be worried. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And more of the same. She told me in every text that she wanted me home and that she loved me. She was very worried. No one was talking about the crazy things she did, as if she hadn't been behaving like a Stephen King character. She even sent different texts. When she wanted me to bring up a loaf of bread, she would typically text novels. After her strange antics, one would think she would have more to say to me. I am aware that those of you who are far removed from this circumstance may find it juvenile. However, I believe my reaction was justified if you saw how Lynn stared at me, how she scampered away on all fours like a crazed animal, and how she smiled at me from inside the closet like a crazy person. In the end, I spent one more night with Chris and Rebecca. Fortunately, Lynn's face wasn't observing me through the window when I woke up yesterday, as I didn't wake up until after midday. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca responded. I knew she wanted to bring up the topic without coming across as intrusive, because she had prepared a sandwich for us both for lunch. With cautious word choice, I answered, I don't. No, she's like a different person. I still wasn't prepared for her or Chris to understand how completely insane I'd been living with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she replied. Always the mediator. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I replied. The words made my heart hurt. My wife was someone I loved and missed. However, how could I cohabitate with such a person? It did not sound very pleasant to live in continual fear. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed. She responded. I said, I don't know about that. Rebecca sadly shook her head and remarked, "Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know." Her comments took a full minute to fully register, and when they did, I felt a chill creep through my body. With my mouth suddenly dry, I said, "Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn?" As though that revelation weren't enough to give her nightmares, Rebecca nodded nonchalantly. Perhaps it wasn't for her. As she cleared the plates off the table, she remarked, "She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work. I didn't see her car, though. Maybe she took an Uber or something." My face began to perspire as I inquired, "Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside?" I started scanning the area, looking at nooks and crannies as if there were predators hiding there. No. She just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. Just said to let you sleep. She stated while doing the dishes. "That's all? She didn't say anything else?" I responded. "No. She looked awful, though. Like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her." I thanked Rebecca for lunch and rose from the table. The fact that at least she hadn't entered made me feel a little better. I had to make sure the doors were locked, though. I sat for a long time, trying to think of what to do. Even though I didn't want to return home, I felt obligated to Lynn to assist her if I could. I had taken an oath to love and respect her in good times and bad. She was obviously terribly ill. I had to make an effort to get her the assistance she required if she was ill, which I firmly felt to be the case. However, I was unsure of where to begin. What the devil was I going to tell the police anyway? And I didn't want to call them? That I was being eyed by my wife? That her behavior was eerie? Even though she had been strange, she had not yet broken any laws. At least not yet. Most likely, the cops would have said that I was exaggerating. However, this was no joke. It didn't feel right, even dangerous, as if her smile concealed something evil. As her spouse, I was aware that I had every right to have her committed. But what if she just behaved normally around them? Evidently, she had succeeded in making Rebecca believe she was merely a worried wife. After 72 hours, the doctors would have no choice but to release her if they didn't determine that she posed a risk to herself or others. I was overwhelmed and lost, so I did what any husband would do in my situation. I gave her mom a call. Trust me, I didn't want to. I never got along well with her mother, Mary Ann. We had never gotten into a fight or anything similar. She was simply not a really gregarious person and was difficult to get along with. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it was merely a thin-lipped smile that left her eyes as lifeless as before. She exuded an aura that suggested she was constantly attacking. Had only had 2 encounters with her, and both were brief. It seemed to me that she disapproved of me for her daughter. I appreciated that Lynn always rushed us out promptly, since she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable. The presence of her mother was nearly intolerable, as if you were walking on glass. We didn't have to see her as much after we moved 3 states away, which pleased me. I needed the woman's assistance, but I was glad to avoid her. I had to talk to someone, and that someone had to know Lynn better than I did, even if I really didn't want to talk to her. I clenched my jaw and performed what I had to do. "Yes," she said, already coming across as agitated. "Mary Ann, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk?" I replied. She was clucking her tongue irritably, and I could hear it. "I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment." "What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin?" she said with coolness. "It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something—" I was abruptly interrupted. "It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin." "What is that you want from me?" she inquired. She was wearing trousers and a thin sweater, and I could practically see her standing there tapping her fingernails anxiously on the table. "I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior," Or possibly any mental health issues? I said. She paused for a lengthy, awkward moment, but I couldn't tell if it was because she was simply pondering or anything else. After a few seconds, she finally said something. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if it is, I don't find the humor in it. Now, as I've mentioned, I do have business to attend to, so if you don't mind, she continued, but I interrupted her before she could expel me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother you would be as well. I stated with a voice that conveyed my anger. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me. She exploded. For some reason, I was frantic to keep her from hanging up, even though I could tell she was just seconds away. She seemed to know far more than she was admitting, in my opinion. Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn. I made an effort. As though she were struggling to maintain her hard demeanor, I heard a slight trembling intake of breath. I said, Marianne? I tried to call out to her, but she hung up. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I made an effort to comprehend the call and her denial of assistance. Why wouldn't she want to support her own daughter even if she didn't like me? I was unable to comprehend that. Desperate to discover what I had missed, I attempted to re-record the exchange. After a while, I was on the verge of giving up, but then I recalled her final words to me. Seek professional help. She had spoken them quite urgently. It's possible that I was just trying to figure out what to do, but I was certain that her tone had changed significantly when she said that, as though they were crucial. What did she mean? Perhaps she was referring to someone else, but I thought she had been speaking to medical experts, someone she didn't feel comfortable speaking to directly for some reason. Or perhaps I was simply desperate. After a lengthy and draining chat with Chris and Rebecca, I persuaded them that Lynn indeed needed psychiatric assistance while I waited for him to return home. I kept some things from them. I informed them about our previous experience, but I wasn't ready to get into it just yet. How she had crept into the restroom and looked at me through the closet. Fortunately, they believed me, even though they were clearly astonished. All they wanted to do was assist her. They still didn't believe it to be that serious. Strange, perhaps, but not harmful. They simply insisted that Lynn must be pulling a strange practical prank. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca said, somewhat hesitantly. Chris didn't believe it was time to call the police. Instead, he volunteered to accompany me, which I gladly accepted. The best line of action, he reasoned, was to speak to her gently and try to persuade her to depart voluntarily. I agreed to follow his instructions. I wouldn't be entering the house by myself, at least. This morning, shortly after breakfast, we took a car over. I couldn't possibly travel at night. My stomach started to turn around as soon as we turned into the driveway. Even though her automobile wasn't there, I remained vigilant. For a moment, I thought we may see her eyes peering through the open front door. I was trembling and perspiring. But Chris was all right. With his hands in his pockets as if he were going for a fucking walk in the park, he waited for me to open the door. I was envious of his ignorance. The smell of rot hit me as soon as I pushed the door open. Chris, who followed me into the home with his nose wrinkled, also smelled it. What do you guys use to clean the floors around here, shit? Chris grumbled. Shut up, I murmured, looking around to see if Lynn was there. Even though it was 10 in the morning, the home was dark and eerily silent. Every curtain was drawn tightly, preventing any light from entering. I would have assumed the house was deserted if I hadn't left it 2 days earlier. As we went through each area, we called her name a few times and carefully looked anywhere she may hide. Chris finally said, "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" He was staring at me like I was a fool and asked, "Aren't we looking for your wife?" I muttered. "Let's just go upstairs." Despite shaking his head, he accompanied me upstairs to inspect the extra bedroom and bathroom. My sneakers crunched on. Glass fragments that appeared to have been scattered over a few of the stairs as I ascended. On the wall beside the stairway, I saw that one of the wedding photographs of Lynn and me was broken. All the glass was gone and the frame hung crookedly. A knot formed in my throat as I gazed at the photo. The picture was shot just after we said our vows and left the church. She was stunning in her white gown. I gazed at Lynn's lovely face. I never imagined that I would ever be afraid of her face. We upped the remaining stairs and examined the extra bedroom, although it appeared to be in perfect condition. My terror from that night suddenly returned, making me reluctant to use the restroom. When Chris saw, he volunteered to enter alone, but I wouldn't let him. Together we entered and looked in the shower and closet. It appeared as though no one had been in the restroom since the evening I departed. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris replied. I stuffed some clothing into a duffel bag after nodding and entering our bedroom. I discovered the source of the odor and gagged as I looked inside our closet. After a single glance, Chris's face went completely white. To escape the sight and stench, he had to go stand by the stairs. The contents of my bedroom closet shocked me as I looked down. At least a dozen pairs of nicely arranged eyeballs were soaking into the rug. While some were as small as a marble, others were as big as a quarter. I shivered when I looked down at the eyes she had gathered from tiny creatures and wondered how she had obtained them. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs. Chris gasped. From the hallway, he called, "Ben, I think we should go." "I'm getting nauseous." "Okay." I closed the closet door on my new nightmare and picked up my luggage. I took a big breath as I stepped out into the hall. I had to gag because I could taste the rot on my tongue. "Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that?" Chris grumbled. "I tried to tell you she needed help," I said. "She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist." He replied. He mumbled, "You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any—" As his eyes widened in terror. He wasn't asked why. I sensed it. I was being watched, but I didn't believe it was the eyes in the closet. I gently scanned the bedroom as I turned around. I whispered "Christ" when I realized what we had been missing. My wife was curled up on her side beneath the bed, watching us with the glee of a child on Christmas morning. Her hands were trembling, with anticipation as she clasped them together just behind her chin. I could hear the soft sounds she was making now that she was aware that she had been located. There was a kind of hiccuping sound in her throat, as though she couldn't handle the thrill. To put it mildly, it was unsettling. That same broad smile and wide eyes. I resisted the need to run that was inside of me. My wife was this. She was the woman I married, no matter how perverted. I had to assist her. "Lynn," I uttered quietly. Her head swayed back and forth in two brief, tiny movements as though nodding, but she didn't answer. "Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?" I said. I had moved forward a single step, like some ferocious monster toward her. I took a step closer and whispered, "I love you, Lynn." I had to fight the impulse to run when she gave out a little sigh through her open mouth. Her eyes grew as big as saucers and her shoulders began to tremble. As soon as I knelt down to have a better look at her, I noticed the blood. It was all over her hands. The closer I came, the more they shuddered, as though she could not control herself. "Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding," I said. With her bloodied fingers running up and down like they were playing an unseen piano, she bobbed her head once again. Occasionally, they scraped her chin, causing bloodstains to appear on her flesh. Wanted to flinch away in dismay. She had an awful stench emanating from her. The puke was attempting to get up my throat. Blood was leaking between the crevices in her thin, dry lips. I didn't want to abandon her in her current state, even though I knew she wouldn't come out on her own. I moved in closer and made contact with her. Her palms trembled and her fingers flexed as the enthusiastic hiccuping sounds grew louder. At that moment, I noticed blood seeping from between her fingers. "Oh my God, Lynn. You're bleeding," I replied. I instinctively extended my hand to grasp hers, but before I could make contact, her hand shot out in my direction. My arm ached sharply and I collapsed back onto my ass. I could see the blood spilling onto the carpet from the burn on my arm. Incredulously, I turned to face her again and found her smiling wildly while holding a big piece of glass in her fingers. From behind me, Chris said, "You all right in there?" Cradling my arm to my chest, I nodded to him while turning my head slightly. I glanced back at Lynn and noticed that her attention had changed. She had stopped staring at me. Furthermore, her smile was vanished. Her eyes were glaring at Chris, almost like a lion would glare at an antelope as she looked past me. Her mouth was curled into a scowl, but it was still hanging open. Afraid to look away from her, I stood up and started to backtrack down the hallway. Chris said, "Are you bleeding?" Lynn quickly scooted out from under the bed, the glass shard. Still in her fist as soon as he finished speaking, I said, "Chris, run, go!" I felt my back crash into his a second later, so he must have been too scared to move. He continued to stand at the top of the stairs, gazing at my wife. The horror. Lynn was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, her face contorted with anger, having crawled out from beneath the bed entirely. She was obviously tense all over. Blood spilled over the floor from her fingers. I grabbed back and shoved him in the direction of the stairs. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris murmured. "You, playing hide and seek?" I spoke the words, "Move your ass, Chris," while being as firm as possible, with quick, short movements. Lynn bobbed her head and started to smile, opening her mouth wider and wider until her chin appeared to touch her chest. Chris was racing down the stairs when I heard him mumble a prayer. I paused at the top of the stairs, torn, between my desire to protect myself and my affection for a woman who was obviously in dire need of assistance. I choked back tears as I answered, "I only want to help." She carefully raised the glass and held it out in front of her, her gaze returning to me. Then, beaming with pure joy, she began running in my direction. Fortunately, my body took over and I skimmed down the steps several times. She sprang onto my back as soon as I reached the front door, putting her arms around my neck and her mouth open next to my ear so I could hear those awful hiccuping noises up close. I knocked her to the ground and shook her off me. As she left, I felt a sharp pain in my back, but I ripped open the front door and ran to my car. Chris stood in the front yard, chatting with the police on the phone. I simply hurried to my car and got in without saying anything. Following my lead, Chris stayed. On the line with 911, I was certain that I would see her racing after us in the rearview mirror. However, I never did. I immediately rushed to the emergency room and received 3 stitches on my back and 11 in my arm. Naturally, Lynn wasn't present when the police returned to the residence to conduct a search and asked a lot of questions. They suggested that I get a restraining order as quickly as possible and stay with a friend or family member for a while, but none of those things would make a difference. I just knew somehow. After dropping Chris off at his house, I traveled an hour away to a motel. I wanted to detach myself from Lynn as much as possible. I have spent the last 4 hours here. I hoped that the cops would track her down and provide her with the much-needed assistance. I don't think so now, though, because I received a text message from an unknown number 40 minutes ago. 3 words only. "I found you," with an accompanying photo. Even though the image was blurry and dark, I recognized it right away. My wife's eye was unmistakable. I immediately began typing this out. I'm at a loss on what to do. I feel like someone is watching me, and I'm afraid and alone.